Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 4. Mirage. It was a staggering 103 degrees in Quartzsite, Arizona. Copper-like trails, gracefully played throughout the skies, provided by the sands of the vast Sonoran Desert below. The arrays of dust blew gently, then broke into clouds of discord as they met their demise along a large metal post that held up the lengthy metal-woven fence to either side. Atop the metal stud, fastened with screws, rested a dingy yellow sign that read, "No trespassing." Off in the distance, beyond the thin protective layer of metal fencing, sat a large, sprawling farmhouse made up of decorative stone and wood siding, mired in its peeling paint. Creatively wrapping the house were large, beautiful arched windows that carried the Arizona sunlight in through the rustic domicile and brightened the varnished hardwood floors within the home. The interior was immersed in a silence it rarely heard before, with the soft ticking sound of a battery-operated clock that hung on the backsplash of the galley-style kitchen's double sink. Other than the flood of light that seemed to lazily drift along the floors, the house was dimly lit. The living room was expansive in the single-story home and was raised a few steps higher than the adjacent foyer, which led to the exterior wood entry doors. Then, suddenly, a few loud knocks as a voice came from the front patio beyond the closed doors. "Jack, Jack, you in there?" the visitor loudly questioned. A few knocks shortly followed. "Hello? Anybody home?" questioned the voice one more time. Then, slowly, with a little resistance from one of the aging, lever-handled doorknobs, the door began to open. Little by little, the door continued to open until finally it was fully ajar. Just outside the doorframe stood a tall silhouette of a man darkened by the sunlight behind him, flooding the entryway. As he cautiously walked in, his face became clearer as he attempted again to gain the attention of any potential occupants. It was Thomas, Seth's father. "Hello, anyone?" he said again with a growing expression of disappointment. He peered around a few corners, taking in the emptiness of the residence. While still seeming to anticipate some sort of response, he double-checked his trail leading back to where he had come from, seemingly checking on something or someone he held importance with. Having made himself comfortable with whatever it was he had just checked on, he began to explore once more. He was now standing in the open field, next to the side of the home, studying the doors that were before him. They were large, makeshift doors that almost lay flat on the ground, with the bottom of the doors flush to the dirt. They angled slightly in a way that the tops of the doors were about 2 feet high. There was a latch fastened to the door that was sitting in an open position that one could close and lock when not in use. Thomas reached down and opened the 2 heavy wooden doors and looked down to a dark stairwell. He looked around while squinting his eyes, protecting them from the sun to see if maybe anyone was perhaps out on the property. All he could see were a couple of horses grazing on some weeds off in the distance, but within the fence. He looked back down into the darkness, hesitated a little, and then carefully made his way down the steps. As he slowly made his way to the bottom, his eyes adjusted to the semi-darkness that surrounded him. He noticed a dim light emanating from around a concrete corner. "Anyone down here?" he asked as he began to peer around a corner into a lightly lit room. As his eyes made their way around the bend to gather the entirety of the room, now within his line of sight, he was greeted with a gun pointed directly at his head. "I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing on my property, but I'm going to give you 3 seconds to turn around and go back the way you came," Jack said, with commanding authority in his voice. With his hands now in the air, Thomas nervously hesitated while stammering his words about. You don't understand. I was sheltering with my son. He's out in the car now," he noted as he timidly gestured up the stairs. Jack looked past the intruder up the stairs and turned his scowl back towards his unwanted visitor. "We were in the basement of a school in San Diego. I think we ran into your grandkids, the older one, Beck. She gave me this address. I promised I'd get them here." Jack's face went blank with astonishment. Thomas and Jack rounded the corner of the century-old farmhouse and gazed upon a dusty green Honda Civic. The back doors sprung open. "Gramps!" Both the kids shouted in desperate and excited voices. The kids began to run towards their grandfather, with pure joy written all over their faces. Behind them, a young Seth, indifferent to the situation, slowly removed himself from the front passenger seat of the car and watched the teary reunion unfold. Jack, matching the excitement of his family, ran up to them and reached out to catch the incoming youngsters before embracing them with a hug undefinable by words. After several moments of holding them tight, he stood back, teary-eyed, and looked at the 2. "How?" he asked. Beck gave a big smile. "Your address was in my phone. Before it died, I wrote down everything I could out of it that seemed important." Her Gramps let out a huge sigh of relief as he laughed aloud. While still holding his enormous grin, he looked at his little grandson. "And you've gotten big, Tiger." Tiger was Trevor's nickname that his Gramps had bestowed upon him when he was first conceived. After that, the name seemed to catch on, as most of his family addressed him as such. Once, knowing she was carrying a boy, Jack would ask Trevor's mother how his Tiger was doing, while she still held him in her womb. The nickname always brought a big smile to the little boy's face. Once more, Jack took them in for another big embrace. Jack held the 2 while looking over at Thomas. "Thank you, stranger." As Seth walked up to his dad, the 2 of them looked on at the scene in front of them with a sense of happiness as they both maintained mellow smiles. Jack, while still holding onto their shoulders, moved the 2 kids back a few feet and grew a concerned look. "Where's your mom and dad?" The pair immediately changed their body language and facial expressions, making clearly evident the answer to his question. Jack's face fell immediately as he slowly pulled his grandkids back in for a much more somber embrace. As he held them tight, he stared into the large, late afternoon sun, which slowly materialized into a morning sunrise, just beginning to peek over the Ecuadorian jungle. He regained his emotions as he scanned the Cessna's instruments in front of him. "There it is," he said, while wearing a headset, looking over at Eugene sitting in the co-pilot's seat, wearing a similar headset. Eugene looked to where Jack was pointing out the windows and saw a dense jungle with a river flowing through it and a clearing nearby. The flight had taken them nearly half the night. They knew they were in the right area, sometime around 2 in the morning, but were stuck wandering the heavens of the jungle until daybreak, when they would be able to make out a safe place to land. Preferably the airstrip they identified on a map earlier, close to their target that the GPS coordinates had led them to. Eugene looked over at Jack and raised his voice over the Cessna's loud engine. "The clearing next to the river?" he asked. Jack shook his head in agreement and answered, "Yep, that's the Agua Rico River." Eugene gave a half nod while thinking to himself, "I don't see anything. No signs of a refuge, anyway. No structures. No people. No camps. No, nothing." Jack agreed, with a facial expression that said he hoped that Eugene's accurate observations didn't necessarily mean anything. They had to stay positive. The Cessna quickly dropped altitude and began to slow while it straightened itself toward the incoming short landing strip. As it cleared the last of the dense jungle, it made its way to its touchdown at the opening of the dirt strip. Everyone in the plane looked out their windows with concern as nothing reassuring of a safe harbor came into view. As the Cessna began to sprint down the runway, leaving a plume of dust behind it, the 7 onlookers in the back now peered out the plane's small side windows and noticed their surroundings. An electric fence, grown over with the surrounding wildlife vegetation, stood high and inoperable, with warning signs posted in various locations. Attached to the fence's interior were weathered and broken security cameras. Other than that, within the clearing, they were surrounded by the dense forest. And of course, the small barn-sized concrete building that occupied a small area off in the close distance from the landing strip. The aircraft finally came to a complete stop, shortly before exhausting the runway it had earlier engaged, and the rumbling from the engine began to fade. Soon, a peaceful silence began to take back its hold on the immense area that the group were now displaced in. Soon after touching down, the door of the plane began to open as all 9 passengers began to disembark. Amidst the group stretching, yawning, and rubbing their eyes from the long flight, Trevor pulled out a simple GPS tracking device. "This doesn't make any sense. According to the GPS, this is exactly where we're supposed to be. I don't see anything that was described in the broadcast. No grids restored. No secure properties. And definitely no safe fucking harbor. And no sign of Zool, whoever the hell he or she is," Beck added into the list of complaints. Just then, Anne joined the conversation, which was unusual as she was typically a very quiet person. She conversed a lot with her husband, Caleb and Delilah, but was more reserved in the larger group setting. "What about that?" The group turned to the concrete structure that had a doorway with no door, which led into the dark, empty void inside. Seth joined up with Beck, Trevor, and Eugene at the front line of the group, gazing at the small building. "Doesn't seem like much. Doesn't seem like much to me either," Joe stated as he straggled behind the rest, being one of the last to exit the plane. He was closely followed by Jack, making the plane officially vacant. Joe continued, "Surely doesn't seem like the bargain you guys offered me to turn on an entire army of rogue cartel militants." Safe harbor my ass. With that, Seth walked up to the group's pariah while brandishing a large Bowie knife. Nobody asked you for your goddamn opinion, he snapped as he raised his weapon to Joe's throat. Joe casually put his arms up while sighing and rolling his eyes. Jack stepped between the two and held Seth back. This isn't helping anyone, Jack pleaded to Seth. Then, turning to Joe, you stay quiet. He held a stern glance at Joe, which made him recede into a more respectful posture. Pausing for a moment, before feeling satisfied that he had put Joe back in his place, he turned back to Seth. I taught you kids everything you know about combat. He looked down to the knife in Seth's hand, then back up into Seth's eyes. Don't pull it out if you're not planning on using it. Then, Seth, much like Joe, also straightened up to a more respectful demeanor. He gave Joe one final menacing glance, put his knife back under his belt, turned, and walked back over to Beck and Trevor. Trevor, still trying to figure out how they might have ended up in the wrong spot, conjured up his inner caveman and beat his GPS unit on the side a couple times, as if that would do the trick. Fuck. Seth looked over at him. It is what it is. Let's at least try to figure out what the hell this place is. There must be some reason why the broadcast announced a precise GPS location leading us all the way into buttfuck Egypt. With that, he began walking toward the seemingly useless concrete hut. Trevor, still angrily looking at the device in his hand, looked up at his friend walking away, then glanced over to Beck and Eugene. Come on. At that moment, Anne piped up. I'm gonna hang back with the little ones. Eugene turned around to face her. While walking backwards, maintaining lockstep with his team, he replied, Sounds good. Doesn't look like much. Shouldn't take too long. With that, he turned and continued on. As the group progressed towards their target, Trevor had a familiar feeling of being watched. He turned his gaze slightly to the right of the concrete shack beyond the defunct electric fence. There, standing near the start of the jungle, he saw a blurry, dark figure. He couldn't make out specific details, but he felt as if it were staring back at him. For a second, he even swore he felt a vibration coming from the blurred entity. He rubbed his eyes to get a clearer perspective, but by the time he looked back, it had disappeared. Growing tired of these odd events, and frankly becoming quite annoyed by them, he kept quiet of the sighting and didn't bring the matter to anyone's attention. Jack reached into the open door of the plane and pulled out a small blue duffel bag and gave Joe a slight shove. Let's go give them a hand. Jack and Joe, significantly trailing behind at this point, began to jog in an effort to catch up to the four. Everyone but Joe readied their sidearms as they neared the mysterious structure. Trevor and Seth were first to arrive, closely followed by the rest of them. Jack tossed the duffel bag at Trevor's feet, who then promptly knelt down to open it. He extracted 2 mag lights that were sitting amongst a stockpile of tools, batteries, wires, and other devices they'd collected throughout the years. As he rose back to his feet, he handed Seth a flashlight and kept one to himself. Now, on either side of the door, Trevor and Seth peered into the dark room. They each began to illuminate the entirety of the chamber while they completed a scan of every square inch. Once the two were satisfied, there was no imminent danger. They glanced at each other, nodded, then signaled to the rest to follow as they made their entrance. The team slowly poured in. Seth and Beck began to take the left side of the room while Trevor and Eugene took the right. Jack and Joe remained just outside the building and kept a sharp lookout. As the two pairs carefully scanned the entirety of the room, they each noticed evidence along the walls and floor of an old fire that, by the looks of it, must have taken place long ago. They eventually met up near the center back of the concrete enclosure, where all 4 of them were amazed to see what looked like a top-secret entrance of some kind. It was a large steel door with 2 black metal boxes on either side. The box on the right looked like it once had a small door on it, which was no longer there. Instead, just an open indentation within the box that comprised of buttons with numbers on them, like you would see on an old-fashioned payphone. Each box had a dark piece of glass on the front with thin red lines crisscrossing along their surfaces. They appeared to be some kind of scanners. Trevor and Seth kept their flashlights independently trained on either box. They drew to the conclusion that whatever functionality the box once held, it was mainly to serve the purpose of triggering the large steel door in between them to open. With their newfound knowledge, married with their ever-growing curiosities, Beck whispered to Eugene, "This one's all yours." With that, she put her forefinger and thumb together, placed them in her mouth, and gave a loud whistle to the outside door where Jack and Joe stood guard. Within seconds, the duffel bag, once on the dirt, just outside, made a speedy flight towards the floor and landed at Eugene's feet. He then knelt down and, with the help of Trevor and Seth, now both pointing their mag lights at the duffel bag, quickly gathered the supplies he required to hack the computer system and hopefully gain entrance to whatever lay behind the daunting steel door. While Eugene went to work on the small boxes, unscrewing the faceplates, exposing a tangled labyrinth of wires and electrical tape, and fastened down computer chips, Beck began to closely examine the door. She felt around for anything, cracks, bumps, breaches, anything to suggest somehow prying open the steel door might be a good plan B should the hacking attempt fail. She carefully traced her hands from top to bottom and from left to right. She felt every edge and corner that met with the flush concrete walls. To her disappointment, nothing felt feasible that would thrust Plan B into motion. As she held her hands flat to the cold steel at the tippy-top center of the slab, the last place she had to inspect, she froze, gave an audible sigh, and let her arms fall back to her sides. Nothing, she thought to herself. She put her hands in her pockets, turned around and leaned on the big steel door. Then, suddenly, with no warning whatsoever, a substantial metal clang sounded from behind her as she threw herself from the now moving steel door. She turned and looked as the door began to open, revealing a dim green light from behind it, and then quickly looked at Eugene in amazement. Eugene, satisfied with his finished project, promptly stood up and threw her a smile and a wink. They all placed their focus on the now exposed space behind the once closed entry and stared in wonder. Even Jack and Joe slowly approached the four from behind in amazement. They soon realized that what they were staring at, this dimly green-lit room with 4 steel walls, was an elevator.